It all started in the streets of Amman, Jordan, where the echo of prayers shaped the rhythm of our days long before the sun rose. I grew up in an old building, with narrow staircases that made our footsteps reverberate and walls thin enough to hear the lives of the neighbors, but that was my home, my sanctuary. The call of the muezzin, coming from the mosque at the end of the street, was not just a sound to me. It was the soundtrack of my existence, more familiar than the beating of my own heart. My father was not just any man. He was the imam of that mosque, the voice that commanded the reverence of the men in the Friday prayers. When we walked together through the market, I felt the weight and the privilege of that position. With my hijab perfectly arranged and my eyes respectfully lowered, I absorbed the greetings he received, feeling a pride that inflated my chest. I was the imam's daughter, the visible extension of his piety, and I carried this identity like a medal of honor, unaware of the real weight it would have on my shoulders in the future. Before continuing, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any testimonies, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now let's get back to the testimony. My life was a rehearsed choreography of devotion and obedience, a role I played with the precision of a veteran actress. I was the good girl, the one who memorized the Quran faster than her brothers, who never missed a prayer, who served tea to guests with the expected humility. My mother wore her faith like comfortable clothing, flowing between prayers and household chores with a peace I desperately envied but could never achieve. I tried to imitate her, forcing myself to feel that serenity in the rhythm of religious life, especially during Ramadan, when the house smelled of dates and the early morning found us eating together in silence. But looking back now, I see that the cracks were already there, invisible to others but cutting to me. They were small doubts, silenced quickly, like when I asked why women couldn't lead prayers and received only a disappointed look from my father. I learned early on that questioning was not seeking the truth, but rather flirting with disobedience. The university should have been the place where I would find answers, where the study of literature and comparative religion would fill the hollow growing inside me. The University of Jordan campus was vibrant, a mosaic of niqabs, hijabs, and loose hair, where intellectual debates filled the courtyards. I threw myself into studies with a ravenous hunger, devouring history and theology, hoping that academic knowledge would silence the spiritual loneliness. But the loneliness was stubborn. I vividly remember a night during my second year, right after the Tarawih prayers in Ramadan. My roommate Noor was already asleep, and I sat on my bed, still dressed in prayer clothes, shrouded in the darkness of the room. I had just spent hours prostrated, reciting sacred words, and what I felt was absolutely nothing. No shivers, no connection, just the dry echo of a fulfilled ritual. Panic rose in my throat. What kind of imam's daughter feels empty after speaking with God? I stifled my crying with my hand over my mouth, terrified by my own coldness. The turning point, ironically, came disguised as a simple academic duty in my third year. Professor Mansour assigned us sacred texts from different religions for critical analysis, and fate, or something much greater than it, placed the Christian Bible in my hands, specifically the Gospel of John. I remember the knot in my stomach when reading the assignment sheet. I had been taught my whole life that this was a corrupted book, altered, a text full of blasphemies about God having a son. But it was just an assignment, I told myself. I would read it, find the contradictions, write my paper, and prove the superiority of my faith. On a night when the dorm was empty, I opened my laptop to search for the text online, feeling as if I were committing a crime. My hands trembled slightly over the keyboard. It wasn't just fear of being seen. It was a dangerous curiosity, a hunger I couldn't name. When the page loaded and I read, "In the beginning was the Word," I should have closed the tab immediately. Instead, those words pulled me in like a current, and I had no idea I was about to drown to, finally, learn how to breathe. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I read those words 3 times, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. In Islam, we believe in Kalimatullah, the Word of God, but the text before me said something radically different, something prohibited. It said that the word did not just come from God, but was God. I continued scrolling down the page, ignoring the internal alarm screaming blasphemy, until I reached verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I stopped breathing for a moment. God became human? Allah, the transcendent, the holy, the one who is as far above us as the sky is from the earth, had lowered himself to flesh and bone? That was shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. I should have felt repulsion. I should have closed the computer in defense of my faith, but instead, I felt hot tears running down my face in the darkness of the room. I cried without understanding why, staring at a heresy that strangely seemed like the most beautiful thing I had ever read. The idea of a God who doesn't just command from afar, but who descends to be near, broke something hard inside my chest that night. The next night, I promised myself I wouldn't read anymore. I already had enough material to critique the text in my academic paper. But as soon as Noor's breathing became heavy with sleep, there I was, opening the laptop like an addict in search of her fix. It became my secret ritual. I read about Jesus seeing Nathanael under the fig tree before even meeting him, and I read Nathanael's response, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God." Son of God. The phrase I had been trained to hate. But as I read, I realized it didn't speak of biology, but of essence, of an intimacy with the Father that I had never dreamed possible. I was no longer reading to find errors. I was reading like Nicodemus, that Pharisee who went to Jesus at night, hidden in the shadows, afraid of his own questions, but unable to resist the light that emanated from that man. I saw myself on every page, a clandestine seeker groping in the dark. Then, I found the words that would change the architecture of my soul. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. I reread that sentence until the words lost focus. God loved and God gave. My entire religious life had been built on the foundation of what I had to give to God. My obedience, my prayers, my fasting, my modesty, my constant effort to gain his favor and avoid his wrath. It was a transaction. I paid with submission, he, maybe, reciprocated with mercy. But that verse inverted the logic of the universe. It said his love came first. It said salvation was not a wage earned by the sweat of my piety, but a gift delivered by an incomprehensible love, that whoever believes in him, not whoever does everything right, but whoever believes. I felt vertigo, as if the floor had disappeared. Could it be possible? Could it be possible that the burden of being good enough could be lifted from my shoulders? It seemed too good to be true, like fresh water to someone dying of thirst in the desert. Weeks passed and I slipped into a terrifying double life. By day, I was the usual Amira, the dedicated student, the exemplary Muslim, the daughter who made her father proud. But at night, I was consumed by the I am declarations of Jesus. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. He didn't point the way. He claimed to be the way. The final confrontation happened when I read chapter 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That paralyzed me. There was no middle ground, no room to call him just an honored prophet. Either he was the only truth, or he was an insane liar. I began to lose weight, my stomach constantly tied in knots of anxiety. I was lying to everyone, to Noor, to my parents, to my professors, but mainly I was trying to lie to myself, because deep down, I knew the battle was already lost. I believed that corrupted text told the truth, and I was absolutely terrified of the price I would have to pay for that belief. The breaking point came at dawn, about 2 months after I started that clandestine reading. I had reached the end of the Gospel of John, reading about the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion. I read about Jesus on the cross saying, "It is finished," and then the unimaginable, the resurrection. I read about Thomas, who doubted until he touched the wounds and heard the echo of Jesus' words, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." I closed the laptop abruptly at 3 a.m. The silence in the room was deafening, just the sound of Noor's rhythmic breathing. I could no longer contain the storm inside me. I got up stealthily, grabbed my phone, and fled to the communal bathroom in the hallway. I locked myself in one of the stalls, sat on the cold tile floor, and collapsed. I cried as I had never cried in my life, deep, violent sobs that I had to stifle with my hands so as not to wake the entire floor. I cried for the emptiness of years, for the exhaustion of trying to be perfect, and for the absolute terror of what I was about to lose. I cried because I knew my old life had ended there. On that bathroom floor, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the darkness, I whispered my first true prayer. I didn't use the ritual postures. I didn't turn toward Mecca. I didn't recite memorized Arabic words. I just spoke with the honesty of someone who is drowning. Jesus, if you are real, if you are who you say you are, if this love is true, I want to know you. I choose you, whatever the cost. Nothing dramatic happened externally. There were no bright lights or voices from the sky. But internally, the universe shifted on its axis. The fear was still there, pulsing, but underneath it emerged an unknown peace. Not the peace of the absence of problems, but the absolute certainty of a presence. For the first time, I understood the fundamental difference. I spent my life trying to climb up to God with my works. But there, in that dirty bathroom, I realized that God had come down to me. The Word became flesh. He had come to fetch me in my darkness, and my darkness could not overcome him. The following days were the strangest of my existence. I went to classes, took notes, had lunch with friends, and laughed at their jokes, maintaining the facade of the usual Amira. But inside, it was as if I had lived my whole life in black and white, and suddenly the world had exploded in color. Everything seemed more vivid, more real, but also incredibly dangerous. Sitting in the classroom, panic would hit me in cold waves. What have I done? Do I really believe this? But at night, returning to those words, the peace returned. I reread, "In the beginning was the Word," and now understood that it wasn't just a theological title. It was God communicating, expressing himself, becoming vulnerable. I thought of all the times I prayed to a distant and transcendental God, and now I found myself in love with a God who knew what it was to feel hunger, thirst, fatigue, and rejection. A God who had skin and bones. This wasn't just a change of religion, it was a complete revolution in my understanding of reality. I knew I would explode if I didn't talk to someone. But who? My family would disown me, my university friends would think I had gone mad. The loneliness was a physical weight. So I did what any young person of my generation would do. I went to the internet. But I knew I needed to be careful. I didn't look for traditional churches, Orthodox or Catholic, full of Arab Christians by birth. They had their own culture and would hardly understand the turmoil of leaving Islam. I searched specifically for believers from a Muslim background. I found a discreet forum with a cautious warning and a simple email address. I stared at that address for 3 days, paralyzed by paranoia. What if it was a trap by the religious police? What if it was a test? But the need for connection was greater than the fear. I wrote a short email without my real name. I am a student in Amman. I have been reading the Bible. I believe in Jesus, but I don't know what to do. I need help. I hit send with my heart in my mouth, feeling like I had just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. The reply arrived 2 days later, short, warm, but extremely cautious. The sender signed only as Sarah. She didn't give me an address right away. Instead, she began a careful dance of questions and answers. How long have you been reading? Does anyone else know? Do you feel safe? We exchanged several emails over that week. I knew she was testing me, verifying if I wasn't a spy or someone with bad intentions trying to expose the group. In our part of the world, trust is an expensive currency, and betrayal can cost one's life. When she finally felt safe, she sent an address and a time. Friday afternoon, during the Jumu'ah prayer time. The irony didn't escape me. It was the perfect moment, when the streets would be quieter and most men, including the moral watchers of the neighborhood, would be busy at the mosque. It was a hiding place in plain sight, protected by the very religious rhythm I was abandoning. I told Noor I would spend the afternoon at the library studying for an important exam. I put on my hijab with the usual care, making sure no strand of hair escaped, and looked in the mirror. The reflected image was that of a devout Muslim woman, indistinguishable from thousands of other women in Amman, but inside, my heart beat in a frenetic rhythm of guilt and expectation. The address led to a modest apartment building in a middle-class neighborhood not too far from campus. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, my legs feeling like lead. Every noise in the hallway made me jump. What am I doing? I thought. Am I walking straight into a trap or toward my freedom? I stopped in front of door number 304, took a deep breath trying to calm the shaking in my hands, and gave 2 light knocks, as instructed. The sound of wood under my fingers seemed to echo like thunder in that silent corridor. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone was waiting on the other side. A woman in her 30s appeared. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, and her hair was uncovered. Her smile was genuine, loaded with an empathy that disarmed me instantly. She said only one word: "Welcome." I entered, and she locked the door quickly behind me. The apartment was small, simply furnished, but welcoming. There were about 8 people sitting on cushions on the floor, forming an irregular circle. They were men and women, some young like me, others older with faces marked by time. Everyone looked at me, and I prepared myself for judgment, for suspicion. But what I found in those looks was something that made me want to cry right there, in the hallway. Understanding. They didn't look at me with morbid curiosity. They looked like war veterans receiving a wounded new recruit. They knew. They understood the cost, the fear, and the madness of being there. Sarah introduced me using only my first name and explained that this was a refuge for believers from a Muslim background. When they invited me to speak, I thought I would remain silent, but the words poured out. I told them about Professor Mansour's assignment, about the nights reading John by the light of the laptop, about the crying in the bathroom at 3 a.m. When I finished, I saw tears on several faces. Karim, a gentleman with a gentle look, told how he had been a Muslim for 40 years before Jesus found him, and spoke of the overwhelming relief of discovering that salvation was already paid for. Ela, a young woman with invisible scars in her eyes, shared how she had been disowned by her family 2 years earlier, but that she had never been alone, for Christ walked with her. Listening to those stories, I felt the isolation dissolve. I wasn't a freak. I wasn't the only one. There on that living room floor, surrounded by strangers sharing the most dangerous secret of my life, I realized I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for: a family. That first meeting lasted 3 hours, but passed as if it were minutes. We studied the Gospel of Matthew, and at the end, we prayed. Not the recited and choreographed prayers I was used to, but spontaneous, raw prayers. People spoke to God as if He were sitting in the middle of the room, like children speaking to a loving father. It was beautiful, strange, and completely destabilizing for my religious mind. I started attending the group twice a week, always changing locations for safety. They began to patiently teach me the concept of grace, something that had no real equivalent in my old world. The idea that salvation was a free gift and not a wage earned by effort was offensive to my pride. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to do something to deserve it. But Karim repeated tirelessly, "A gift you earn by merit is not a gift, it is payment. And salvation is not a wage." I had to unlearn the market logic of my previous faith to accept the scandalous generosity of Jesus. I also faced the theological obstacles that seemed like insurmountable mountains. The Trinity, one God in 3 persons, seemed absurd to my monotheistic mind, trained to see any division in God as blasphemy. I cannot say I completely understood the divine mechanics, and perhaps I never will, but I accepted it because it was what Jesus taught and what the Bible revealed. I decided to trust the person of Jesus, even when theology challenged my logic. The change in prayer was another seismic shock. Learning that I didn't need to wash ritually, nor turn to a specific direction, nor use classical Arabic, seemed at first disrespectful, but I tried. I started praying while walking to class, talking to God in my mind, telling Him my fears, and He answered, not with thunder, but with a peace that guarded my heart. Intimacy replaced ritual, and the constant presence of God became more real than any physical prostration I had ever done. About a month later, Sarah brought up the subject of baptism. She explained that it wasn't just a cleansing ritual like voodoo. but a public declaration of death and resurrection. Entering the water meant dying with Christ. Coming out meant rising to a new life. She asked if I had thought about it. The truth is, I had pushed that thought to the back of my mind because it terrified me. Baptism was the point of no return. As long as I was just a secret sympathizer, there was still an escape route. But being baptized was crossing the Rubicon. It was drawing a line in the sand and saying there was no going back. I spent weeks agonizing over this, feeling the weight of the decision. But then I realized I had already crossed the line that night in the bathroom. The external act would only make visible what was already irrevocable inside. With my heart in my throat, I told Sarah, I want to be baptized. We scheduled it for a Thursday night at the apartment of a brother who had a large bathtub, something rare in our neighborhood. I arrived after dark, trembling so much I could barely speak. The core group was there. Sarah asked me to make a brief declaration of faith. Standing in that small room, surrounded by my new family, I confessed with a choked voice that Jesus was the Son of God and my only Savior. Then I entered the filled bathtub, dressed in a simple tunic. Karim entered with me. When he said, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and plunged me into the water, I felt time stop. In that submerged second, the old Amira, the Imam's daughter, the perfect girl, the slave of fear, died. And when I broke the surface of the water, gasping and laughing at the same time, I was another person. A wild and inexplicable joy took over us. We were singing hymns softly so as not to alert the neighbors, but my heart was screaming. I still had a double life out there, but in that moment, wet and embraced by Sarah, I knew to whom I belonged. I was finally free. The months following my baptism were a dizzying blur of spiritual ecstasy and paralyzing terror. I grew in faith, memorizing verses and learning hymns in Arabic that I sang softly in the shower. But the cost of my joy was a constant lie. With every visit to my parents' house, the weight of guilt threatened to crush me. I hugged my mother, smelling the familiar scent of spices on her clothes, and my heart ached with the secret I kept. I looked at my father, seeing the pride in his eyes, and felt like a traitor. I desperately wanted to share with them the peace I had found. I wanted my mother to know the God who does not demand, but loves first. However, fear gagged me. I knew the stories that circulated in the whispers of the community. Daughters beaten, locked in dark rooms, or married off in a hurry to cure apostasy. In Jordan, leaving Islam wasn't just a religious choice. It was a social earthquake, a shame that stained the family honor for generations. So, I continued acting, a spy in my own home. The double life, however, is a house of cards. Eventually, the wind blows. I had close calls that made my blood run cold. Once, my younger sister Ree borrowed my phone and saw a playlist of Christian worship music. I had to invent a quick and shaky lie, saying it was research material for my comparative religion class. She believed it, but the look of strangeness she gave me remained etched in my mind. The worst moment was when my mother, helping to organize my dorm room during a surprise visit, found the small Bible Sarah had given me hidden at the back of a drawer. Time stopped. She held the book with her fingertips, as if it were a contaminated, radioactive object. It's for college, I lied, feeling the metallic taste of panic in my mouth. I need to read it to understand their errors. She accepted the explanation, but asked me not to bring it home. I realized then that my luck was running out. I was walking in a minefield, and sooner or later I would step in the wrong place. It was during this period of chronic anxiety that I discovered the verse that would become my anchor, my oxygen. I was reading the first letter of John. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. I stopped at those words for a long time. Fear. That was the currency with which I had traded my entire life. Fear of not being good enough, fear of disappointing my father, fear of hell, fear of judgment. Even now, as a Christian, I lived in fear of being discovered. But that text promised something radical. God's love was the antidote. If I truly understood the depth of His love for me, a love that didn't depend on my performance, fear would lose its claws. I began to pray fervently about this, asking God to exchange my dread for trust. The fear didn't disappear magically, but its voice diminished. I began to realize that even if the worst happened, even if I lost everything I had on earth, I would still have Jesus, and he would have to be sufficient. The crisis I feared arrived 6 months after my baptism, not with a scream, but with a smile from my father. On a Friday, he called me to his home office. I sat down, expecting a reprimand about my less frequent visits, but he seemed satisfied. He told me that a young man from an excellent family, a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence named Yusuf, had asked for my hand. My father had already agreed to a preliminary meeting. "You will be the wife of a scholar," he said, beaming. "You will make us very proud." The world spun around me. I knew this day would come, but I wasn't ready. I smiled, nodded, said something vague and polite, but inside I was screaming. I couldn't marry Yusuf. I couldn't marry any Muslim man. Islamic law and the law of my country required children to follow the father's religion. Marrying would mean living a lie for the rest of my life, subjecting my future children to a faith I no longer followed, and denying Christ daily in the privacy of my home. The trap had closed. I had no more time. As soon as I returned to campus, I ran straight to Sarah's apartment, feeling as if I were fleeing a fire. Barely had she opened the door when I spilled everything. The proposal, my father's joy, the tight schedule. "They want the formal meeting in 2 weeks," I sobbed. "If it goes well, I'll be engaged in a month." Sarah listened to me in silence, pouring me water while I shook. When I finished, she asked me the question I feared. "What do you want to do?" I looked at her with despair. "I cannot marry him. I cannot live pretending." She nodded gently. "Then you know what you have to do." I knew. I had known for months, actually. The only way out was the truth. I needed to go to my family and say I was a follower of Jesus Christ. That night, the community prayed for me for hours. They prayed for courage, for wise words, and for the physical protection I would certainly need. Sarah was honest about the risks: disinheritance, violence, expulsion, but reminded me that the truth, however painful, was the only solid ground where I could stand. The next 2 weeks were a slow agony. I couldn't concentrate on classes. I spent nights rehearsing dialogues in my head, imagining every possible scenario, from screams to deadly silence. I clung to my Bible like a castaway to a plank, repeating God's promises: "I will not leave you nor forsake you." When Friday arrived, I took the bus home with sweaty hands and a churning stomach. My family welcomed me with the usual joy, exacerbated by the prospect of the wedding. My mother chattered about clothes and preparations. My sister Ree laughed about being a bridesmaid, and I forced myself to smile, feeling like an imposter amidst those people I loved so much. Every laugh of theirs was a stab in my chest because I knew I was about to destroy that happiness. That night, after dinner, I asked to speak with my father alone. He seemed pleased, probably expecting me to want to discuss details about the meeting with Yusuf's family. We entered his office, a sanctuary of old books and the smell of mint tea, the place where he wrote his sermons and counseled the community. He sat behind the large wooden desk, radiating authority and paternal affection. Behind him, on the wall, was the framed calligraphy of the Shahada: "There is no God but Allah." I had looked at those words my entire life, but now they seemed to accuse me. I stood before him, feeling small like a child who broke a valuable vase. I opened my mouth to say, "Baba, I have become a Christian," but the words stuck in my throat. I looked at his face, at the pride and love shining there, and the courage I had built with so many prayers simply evaporated. Instead of the truth, I heard my own voice say something totally different, something cowardly. "I need more time, Baba. I'm not ready to marry. I want to focus on my studies, finish my degree first." It wasn't the full truth. It was a half-truth designed to buy time and avoid conflict. My father frowned, surprised and slightly disappointed. Delays in arranged marriages were viewed with suspicion. But, for love of me, he sighed and agreed. "All right, we can wait on the marriage until after graduation," he said. "But the meeting with Yusuf's family next week continues. Let's seal the engagement now and marry later." I nodded, feeling sick. I had gone there to free myself, and instead, I had trapped myself even further in the web of lies. I left the office and went to my old room, sitting on the bed where I grew up, shaking with shame. I had failed. God had given me an opportunity, and I had chosen comfort instead of the cross. I returned to campus on Sunday, carrying shame that seemed to weigh tons. I didn't tell anyone in the community what had happened. I was too humiliated. I had had the chance to witness to the truth and chose the safety of one more lie. I tried to pray, but the words sounded hollow. I tried to read the Bible, but I felt like a hypocrite, someone playing at having faith but lacking the courage to live it. The meeting with Yusuf's family was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and time seemed to run faster than ever. My mother called constantly to discuss what dress I should wear, how I should behave, what topics were appropriate. I gave monosyllabic answers, said I was busy with exams, invented excuses. But inside, I was drowning. I knew I was only postponing the inevitable and making the final explosion even more destructive. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and confessed everything to Sarah. We met at a cafe far from the university, where the risk of being seen was lower. I told her how I froze in my father's office, how I agreed to the engagement just to be able to leave the room, how I felt like a terrible Christian. I expected her to be disappointed, maybe even angry. Instead, she reached across the table and held my hand. She told me that when she had to tell her family, she failed twice before succeeding on the third time. God doesn't love you because you are brave, Amira, she said firmly. He loves you because you are His, and He is patient with you, even when you are not patient with yourself. Those words were like a balm. She reminded me that courage isn't something we manufacture, but something we receive, and that the Holy Spirit would give me the right words at the right time. However, a new conviction began to grow in me in the following days. I might be afraid to speak the truth about Jesus, but I didn't have the right to drag another family into my lie. Letting Yusuf's family come to our house, creating expectations, wasting time and honor in a negotiation I knew to be false, was cruel. It was unfair to them and unfair to Yusuf. I needed to stop it before it happened. I realized that if I couldn't tell the whole truth yet, I needed to at least tell a part of it to stop the engagement. The decision gave me a strange sense of calm. I wouldn't wait until the wedding day to run away. I would start dismantling the trap now. I called my father on a Wednesday night. When he answered, my voice must have been serious because he immediately asked if something was wrong. I took a deep breath and said, Baba, I need to be honest. I cannot marry Yusuf. It's not just a matter of waiting for graduation. I am not ready to marry, period. I have issues, doubts that I need to resolve before committing to someone. There was a long, icy silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke, his voice was unrecognizable, stripped of all affection. What kind of doubts? He demanded. Have you been hanging around the wrong people at the university? Western ideas? I said no, that it was something personal, about who I was. He didn't take it well. He said he was disappointed, that I was bringing shame with my indecision. I will cancel the meeting, he said dryly, but I hope you resolve these doubts soon. I won't wait forever to see you properly settled. He hung up without saying goodbye. I held the phone, trembling, knowing I had just fired the first shot of a war I couldn't win. The following months were a strange emotional purgatory. I bought time, yes, but I didn't know what to do with it. My father's voice on the phone became cold and distant, a silent punishment for my rebellion. My mother, on the other hand, oscillated between worry that I was depressed and irritation that I wasn't fulfilling my social role. I continued living in two worlds, and the tension was becoming unbearable. In fellowship with the brothers, I could be myself, pray freely, cry, laugh, study the word. But everywhere else, I was an actress on a stage that never went dark. It was at this time that I understood viscerally what Jesus meant by, take up your cross daily. Before, I thought it was a poetic metaphor about enduring hardships. Now I understood it was literal. Taking up the cross meant choosing to die every day. Dying to the desire to please my parents, dying to the comfort of social acceptance, dying to the instinct of self-preservation. Every morning upon waking, I had to decide again if Jesus was worth the pain I was causing and the pain I was feeling. The reality of physical danger hit me on a Friday, when I went to the mosque near campus to keep up appearances. I sat in the women's section, separated from the men by the usual partition, listening to the sermon echo through the speakers. The imam spoke about the dangers of modernity, and specifically about apostasy. His voice rose and fell with a terrible passion as he described those who abandon Islam as traitors of the worst kind, worse than external enemies, as they corrode the community from within. He cited traditional punishments, mentioning that the blood of an apostate is lawful. I sat there, frozen, feeling the air thin out. I looked around and saw women I knew, colleagues, neighbors, nodding in agreement. If they knew who I was now, would they agree that I deserved to die? I left before the end of the prayer, feeling like I was going to vomit. That wasn't just about disappointing my father. It was about survival. I was living among people who believed, sincerely, that eliminating someone like me was an act of devotion to God. That night, I asked Sarah if she felt afraid. She was silent for a moment and admitted that yes, many times. But then she told me something that changed my perspective. Courage is not the absence of fear, Amira. Courage is looking at fear and deciding that Jesus is greater. She reminded me of the disciples who fled and denied Jesus when fear tightened its grip, but who, after receiving the Holy Spirit, faced prisons and death with boldness. The question wasn't whether I was afraid. Of course I was. The question was whether I believed Jesus was just a better religious option, or if he was life itself. If he was just an option, the cost was too high. But if he was life, then turning back meant choosing death. And I realized there that, however terrifying the path ahead was, going back to the spiritual void of before was impossible. I had tasted the living water. I couldn't go back to drinking sand. I then began a risky and silent mission, reaching my younger sister, Ree. I couldn't preach openly to her. It would be too dangerous for both of us. But I started asking questions. I would call her and, in the middle of banal conversations, drop seeds of doubt. I asked what she thought of certain rules, if she felt God heard her, if she was afraid. Initially, she recoiled, confused, but gradually she began to open up. She confessed her own doubts, those forbidden questions every Muslim woman has but never dares to vocalize. I became her safe harbor, the only person who said, "It's normal to ask. God is big enough to handle your doubts." I prayed for her with fierce intensity, asking God to open her eyes as he opened mine. I knew my time was running out, that the final explosion with my father was imminent with the approach of my graduation, and I desperately wanted to leave a light on in my sister's heart before leaving. The last semester of university began with a countdown pulsing in my head. There were 3 months left until graduation. 3 months until the excuse of studies expired and reality crashed down on me. On one of those sleepless nights, I returned to the Gospel of John, chapter 12, and read Jesus' words that seemed to have been written for that exact moment of my life. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. I stared at the screen. I had been trying to hold on to 2 lives, trying to avoid the death of my old self so as not to lose my family. But Jesus was clear. The seed has to die. There is no resurrection without burial. And for the first time, a strange hope sprouted in the midst of my fear. Maybe my social death, the loss of my family and my status, wasn't a sterile waste. Maybe, if I fell into the earth and died, God could use that to produce fruit I couldn't see. Maybe in Ree, maybe in others. I had to trust that the God who asked for my life knew what to do with it. In May, the inevitable phone call happened. My father was direct, without affectionate preambles. There was another suitor, from an even more prestigious family than Yusuf's, ready to seal the commitment as soon as I received my diploma. "I will accept no more excuses, Amira," he said with a finality that chilled my bones. "You have stalled enough. I expect a definitive answer when you come home this weekend." I hung up the phone, knowing time had run out. I called Sarah and said only, "It's now." I packed a small bag with the essentials, my documents, a change of clothes, my laptop, and, hidden at the bottom, my Bible. I looked at my dorm room, at the student life I was about to abandon and felt a supernatural calm. It wasn't human courage. It was the certainty of someone who has nothing left to lose because she has already surrendered everything. I took the bus home on Friday afternoon, watching the landscape pass by the window and knowing, with painful clarity, that I was making that trip for the last time. I arrived home and was greeted by the usual smells: cumin, coriander, and the fresh bread my mother made. The normality of the scene was suffocating. Ree hugged me tight, and I had to hold back tears, wondering if she would ever forgive me. After dinner, I asked my parents to talk in the living room. They sat down, my father in his usual armchair, my mother on the sofa, both with expectant expressions, awaiting my yes to the marriage. I stood before them, feeling my heart beating in my throat like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath and released the truth that had been trapped for months. "I cannot accept the marriage proposal," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I cannot marry a Muslim man because I am no longer a Muslim." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I continued before I lost my strength. "I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I follow him now." The reaction was not immediate. There was a moment of paralyzing shock, where my father looked at me as if I had started speaking an alien language. Then comprehension dawned in his eyes, and with it, a fury I had never seen. He stood up slowly. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I am a Christian, Baba," I repeated. The use of the affectionate nickname was the fuse. "Don't call me that," he roared, his voice making the windows vibrate. My mother began to cry, a loud, high-pitched wail of instant mourning. "You are not my daughter," he said, every word like a death sentence. "You died to us." He grabbed a picture frame from the side table, a photo of us smiling on a holiday, and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, scattering shards across the floor. "Get out of my house, now! You are an apostate, a disgrace. Don't take anything I gave you. Get out and never come back." I grabbed my backpack with trembling hands and walked to the door, passing my mother who hid her face in her hands, and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the only life I knew. I walked aimlessly through the streets of the neighborhood where I grew up, my vision blurred by tears, until I fell onto a bench in a dark square. There, alone in the night, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. I had no home, no money, and to the people I loved most in the world, I no longer existed. Fear tried to suffocate me, whispering that I had made a terrible mistake, that Jesus wasn't worth that price. But then, with trembling hands, I dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring. "I told them," I sobbed. "I'm in the square." 20 minutes later, her car's headlights illuminated my darkness. She didn't ask questions. She just hugged me while I cried on her shoulder and took me to the apartment where the community was already gathered, praying. That night, I lost my biological family, but I was received into the arms of a spiritual family that sustained me when I couldn't stand. A week later, I received a short message from my sister, Ree. She said my father had performed the janazah prayer, the funeral prayer, for me at the mosque. To them, Amira was dead. I stared at the phone screen, feeling a chill down my spine. They buried me while I was still breathing, but ironically, I remembered Jesus' words. "I am the resurrection and the life." They were right in a way they didn't understand. The old Amira really had died. The girl enslaved by fear and religious performance had been buried that night. Who lived now was a new creation, someone who had crossed through death and come out the other side. The pain of rejection was real and cutting, but the life that pulsed in me now was indestructible, because it didn't come from my lineage or my effort, but from him who conquered death itself. Today, I write this from a small apartment in another country, where I was sent for safety. Refugee life is lonely. There are days when the longing for my mother's food and my sister's laughter is physical, a pain that doesn't go away. But I have no regrets. Not for a second. I lost my past, yes, but I gained an eternal future. I lost earthly security, but I gained citizenship in an unshakable kingdom. Sometimes I receive messages from secret Christians in the Arab world, people hiding in darkness as I was, asking if it's worth it. And I answer with every beat of my heart, yes. It is worth losing everything to gain the one who is everything. My name is Amira, which means princess, and it took me 23 years to discover that this name was a prophecy. I am not an imam's daughter, nor an apostate, nor a stateless refugee. I am a daughter of the King of Kings. 3 years ago, my family held my funeral, but I have never been so alive. And if you are reading this, hiding, afraid, groping in the dark in search of a light, know this. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot, never could, and never will overcome it. Come out of the grave. Life is waiting for you.
Amira lost the past to gain eternity. And you? If you had to choose today between your family's acceptance and your faith in Jesus, what would be your decision? Leave your sincere answer here in the comments. I want to read your opinion. If this story spoke to your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell right now. Don't miss the next stories. They are transformative, and you need to hear them. Now, don't leave without watching this next testimony appearing on your screen. It is just as impactful as today's. God bless your life greatly. Until next time.